One. Oke, selamat malam teman-teman. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Saya Rizky Amalia Afiat dari Forum Islam Progresif dan Islam Bergerak. Malam ini kita kedatangan tamu istimewa. Dia seorang aktivis dan peneliti, namanya Anne Alexander. Dan untuk malam ini kita akan diskusi tentang tema yang sangat relevan, yaitu tentang perempuan dan perjuangan kelas. Jadi Forum Islam Progresif agendanya adalah mengadakan diskusi tematik tentang perempuan dan kelas ini secara berkala. Nah, untuk edisi perdananya kita akan bicara soal konteks Revolusi Arab atau Arab Spring dan Revolusi Sudan yang beberapa tahun belakangan ini terjadi, dan bagaimana peran perempuan serta perjuangan kelas di dalam konteks revolusi itu. Saya rasa akan banyak sekali hal yang bisa kita pelajari dari Revolusi Sudan dan Revolusi Arab, juga bagaimana dinamika kekuatan Islam sebagai gerakan sosial itu bisa memunculkan geliat perlawanan dan transformasi di era modern sekarang. Oke, sebelumnya saya ingin dulu memperkenalkan Anne Alexander. Teman-teman bisa lihat di sini Anne Alexander. Saya akan memperkenalkan Anne dalam bahasa Indonesia profilnya. Jadi Anne adalah peneliti dan koordinator dari Cambridge Digital Humanities Network di Universitas Cambridge. Dia juga menjadi dosen tamu di Universitas Exeter, SOAS, dan Cambridge. Dia pernah menjadi jurnalis di BBC selama beberapa tahun. Disertasi doktoralnya mengupas tentang gerakan anti kolonial di Mesir dan Irak pasca Perang Dunia Kedua. Dia juga seorang aktivis lapangan, pengorganisir, dan sekarang menjabat sebagai dewan redaksi di International Socialism Journal dan editor di Middle East Solidarity. Tahun 2014 kemarin dia menerbitkan buku dengan Mostafa Bassiouny, judulnya Bread, Freedom, Social Justice, Workers and the Egypt Revolution, yang diterbitkan oleh Z Books. Artikel terbarunya di International Socialism Journal terbit Juni 2019 bertajuk Living on Revolution Time, Understanding the Dynamics of the Uprising in Sudan and Algeria. So I would like to say hi first to Anne before we go ahead with the structure of the discussion. Hi, Anne.
Hi, thank you for inviting me and introducing me.
Okay, so I will explain to the audience, to the participants about the structure of the discussion. So Anne is going to talk for 30 minutes. And then we will head on with the discussion, question and answers for about 45 minutes for this first session. If we still have enough questions and comments from the participants, we will continue with the second session. And then we will close the session with closing remarks. Nah, jadi Anne akan melakukan presentasinya selama 30 menit. Setelah itu disusul oleh sesi diskusi kurang lebih selama 45 menit untuk sesi pertama. Nah, teman-teman bisa bertanya di live session, di live chatnya di YouTube. Kalau mau ingin bertanya, klarifikasi atau mau memberi tanggapan, bisa diketik dalam bahasa Inggris atau dalam bahasa Indonesia. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Anne Alexander. Please, Anne. You can.
Thank you very much. And so the first thing that I just wanted to mention, which is a practical thing, is that I've joined the meeting twice, once with my laptop and once with my computer, and I've done that so that I can share some links, and I'm going to send you I'm going to send everyone in the meeting a link to the slideshow in case you wanted to view it afterwards, but it's being shared for me as well. So the other thing is also that's going to hopefully enable me to share some links to resources and some of the articles that might be relevant if you wanted to look at them afterwards. It's easier to do that on my computer. So basically, to start with, I just wanted to say thank you very much for introducing me and to giving me the chance to come and speak to you today. And I don't, unfortunately, I'm quite ignorant about Indonesia and Indonesian history and politics, but I'm hoping that some of the things that I'm going to say about women and revolution in the Middle East will also spark some interesting points of comparison and for discussion in relation to the situation in Indonesia today. So I was asked by Rizky to prepare something that would talk about the role of women in revolutions in the Middle East, and that this would be a way to open up a wider discussion about the role of women in capitalist society, women's oppression in general, and how we could get to women's liberation. So that's what I've tried to do. I've concentrated in the talk on a couple of things. Could we go to the next slide, please?
Next.
Yeah, if you go to slide number next. So if you go to the next one down.
Next slide. Sorry.
Yes, I think actually if you put it onto slide view, then it will become bigger, and then it's perhaps easier for people to see. But I've shared the link anyway, so everyone can hopefully connect to it directly. So there are two main points that I really want to get across here. One of which is the idea that women's roles in the revolutions, popular uprisings and mass movements which have shaken the Middle East since 2010 follow a wider historical pattern of revolutions as festivals of the oppressed, and these bring questions of liberation from oppression to the fore, and not just political questions about the form of political regime or other sorts of questions such as how society is organized economically or socially. And the second point that I really want to focus on here is that the prominent role of women in the forefront of these mass movements, particularly on the streets and in strikes and in workers' protests, isn't an accident, but flows from the way in which capitalism relies on the continued oppression of women at the same time as exploiting them as wage workers. So, sorry, could we have the next slide, please?
Berikutnya.
Yeah, I think if you just click on the next slide each time, it will it should bring it up. Yes. So if we look at the question of women and revolution, and we take a kind of historical overview, then I would argue that it's very visible that women have played an increasingly visible and active role in revolutions in the modern world. If we went back to, for example, the Paris Commune, 1870 to 1871, when workers and the poor in Paris took over the city, one of the very notable features of that was the very prominent role played by women in the revolutionary struggle on the barricades, organising and agitating. Then if we went forward a generation or so to the Russian Revolution in 1917, again we find women played an extraordinarily important role in the revolution. For example, the first stage of the revolutionary process in 1917, the waves of strikes and protests that brought down the Tsar in February of 1917, These were famously started off by women workers who refused to listen to their male comrades, including the revolutionary leaders from the Bolshevik Party in the St. Petersburg or the Petrograd District Committee, who told them that the time wasn't ripe, and they went out on strike anyway on International Women's Day to demand better wages, and it started the whole process really that snowballed into it becoming a revolution. Sorry, Rizky, I think we've lost the
Yeah, wait. For the technical issues. Okay, I'm sorry. It seems like there is.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So the Russian Revolution was one in which women played a prominent role as part of the revolutionary movement, but also the Russian Revolution was also a time when women's rights in Russia, which was at that point actually a relatively undeveloped country in economic terms. It wasn't the heart of global capitalism. It was actually a society in which reactionary ideas of all sorts were very prominent, and in which the oppression of women was very intense. Suddenly took forward huge leaps in terms of women's rights and progress. For example, women in revolutionary Russia got the right to vote before women did in Britain, and before they did in France. In France, they had to wait till 1945. In Russia, they had it immediately in the revolution. Also, the revolutionary state in its first few years provided things like access to socialized childcare, communal restaurants, laundry services, all sorts of things which actually helped to free women from the drudgery of work in the home. If we move forward then to the 20th century, later on in the 20th century, again, if we look at, for example, the wave of anti-colonial struggles that took place after 1945 against the continuation of against the colonial empires. So, for example, in the Middle East, there were mass revolts and uprisings in a wide range of countries, from including Egypt, including Iraq, including Syria, across North Africa, including Algeria. Women played a very important role in these struggles. And the Iranian Revolution in 1979, again, women played a very significant role on the streets in the early phases of the revolution. And again, if we look at the so-called Arab Spring revolts of 2011, we can see that that women, as I'll come on to explain later in the talk, played a really critical role. In fact, one of the most striking features of those revolutions was the way in which women were at the forefront of the protests and were taking part in street protests, in strikes, and being very visible in the uprisings. The Sudanese and Algerian uprisings, and also actually the Lebanese uprising that's been taking place since late 2019, which we could also talk about. Again, women have been at the forefront of public forms of activism, and playing a key role in revolutionary organising. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So in order to understand this relationship between revolution and women's liberation, I think we need to take a bit of a detour here to look at where does women's oppression come from. And so what I want to do is just spend a few minutes outlining from a Marxist perspective how I understand women's oppression from coming into being. I can start from the basic assumption here is that I would argue strongly that there is no biological or natural basis for women's oppression in society, that women and men are capable of the same kinds of things, and that there is no reason why women should play a fundamentally different role in society to men. However, the ways in which society has been organised actually do make a really significant difference to the roles that men and women play. So, for example, in pre-agricultural societies, I would argue that there was relative equality between men and women in terms of the kind of work and jobs that they did in society. Population growth was quite limited. And women did not spend a vast amount of their lives being pregnant or nursing children, which is something that does actually make a difference to what kind of work you can do in society. It was the rise of agriculture, accompanied by the rise of class society, and the two things are very interlinked, and the emergence of the state, which created the conditions for a new way of dividing work up between men and women, with women's role in producing children becoming more and more important. And actually, women at this point spent much more of their lives either being pregnant or nursing children. The new ruling class that emerged in this phase, or the ruling class that emerged, because one of the key points here is that before the rise of in pre-class societies and hunter-gatherer societies, there wasn't a separate layer of people who did the work of ruling and who took over some of the, some of the products of society for themselves in order to maintain themselves. That class society is not something that has always existed. So this new ruling class that emerged looked to justify the new way of organising society through laws, through organised religion, and by enforcing this sexual division of labour. Can I have the next slide, please? Sorry, can you go on to slide 5? Thank you. So then the question we'd need to ask ourselves really is, why didn't the rise of capitalism just get rid of women's oppression? If women's oppression in pre-capitalist societies was linked very fundamentally to the way in which the economy developed and the agricultural basis of society, why didn't the move to an industrial society just get rid of women's oppression? So the first point to make here is, of course, a quick definition of what capitalism is, that it's a new way of organising production, which turned out to be much more dynamic than previous societies. The central differences was that the economy was driven by competition between different capitals, that's complexes of people and machinery and materials, to capture a greater share of the value created by free labour, as in workers who were not slaves. Economic growth wasn't dependent on women's role in the biological reproduction in quite the same way. Obviously, women still continue to play a fundamental role in biological reproduction, which men don't. But women workers could be just as much a source of surplus value as workers for a capitalist as male workers. And in fact, actually, it's very important to recognise that in general terms, it's not efficient for capitalism to a certain extent to rely on women's oppression, because you're just cutting out half of the productive forces of humanity, and you're excluding people who could make a valuable contribution to your profits, and thinking about it from a capitalist point of view. And interestingly enough, in the early stages of capitalist development, by and large, women and children were exploited in the same way as men, doing the same dirty work and physically demanding work in, for example, mining or in factory work as their male colleagues. Can we have the next slide, please? But this process of what's called primitive accumulation couldn't be sustained for very long. It was dependent on new waves of workers coming in from the countryside to replace those that died in the cities. Actually, cities in the early period of capitalism literally were death traps, that there were more people would die in the city than the cities could not reproduce themselves. And some of this was to do with the crisis around women of childbearing age actually being forced to work and bear children. They were also to do with the fact that cities were very unhealthy, and a whole number of factors, which meant that actually there was a crisis point reached in the places like Britain, where capitalism first emerged, where it became clear that having a sufficient number of workers who were sufficiently healthy to carry on producing value in the same way required a change of tack. And as society became more complex, capitalism developed, greater levels of education and technical skill became intrinsic to how capitalism functioned. There was also a question of having workers at a sufficient level of skill in order to operate machinery, in order to deal with complex processes. And this couldn't be just restricted to a small layer of people who were relatively, a small layer of skilled workers. There had to be a general rise in the levels of skill. So there were two different routes that the capitalist ruling class followed. Firstly, they could socialise some of the process of reproducing the next generation of workers by setting aside some of the surplus they'd stolen from workers in the first place to pay for the healthcare, education, they could have provided communal restaurants, cleaning services, laundries, and so on, in order to free women from the demands of childcare and enable them to work for as long as possible. But they could also privatise these functions again by making them the responsibility of individual working class families, and particularly making working class women carrying out this labour on behalf of the system as a whole. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So, in fact, as capitalism has developed, the ruling class has followed both of these routes, but put more emphasis on one or the other depending on the circumstances. During the 20th century, the advanced capitalist countries have developed systems of healthcare, education, and so on, which have facilitated women's work outside the home and have led over time to a dramatic fall in fertility rates, or they're one of the things that have led to a dramatic fall in fertility rates. But they have also promoted and entrenched the view that women's primary role is as caregivers and mothers. Why do they do this? Well, actually, they get a double benefit from it by pushing onto women a double burden of exploitation and oppression. That if women are expected to be the main people who are responsible for the care of children, for their health, for large parts of their socialization and education for long periods of time, and work outside the home. And in addition to that, because their work is ideologically considered to be less important than men's work, it's an add-on, it's something you do before you're married or while the children are at school, then they can be paid less, they can be sacked first, and so on and so forth. This double burden is of huge benefit to the capitalist class as a whole. Can I have the next slide, please? So this helps us bring us on to the question of women and revolution, and why do revolutions challenge this kind of systematic oppression? So there's a good question. Why have women been at the forefront of revolutions in the modern world? I would argue that revolutions which involve the mass of ordinary people acting collectively to change the world around them always start from the question, always start to raise the question of how to challenge oppression as well as exploitation. Oppression is used by the ruling class to divide ordinary people and keep them suspicious of each other. As people begin to fight back, they start to see who are their real enemies. We can see an example of this in the relationship between men and women. If, for example, in a workplace, there is a strike going on in the context of an authoritarian regime which doesn't allow strikes, and if the workforce involves both men and women, then one of the things that is likely to make the strike more successful is if sexism and divisions between men and women workers can be overcome. so that women are not brought in, for example, and encouraged to break the strike, or that if women start the strike, that their male colleagues join them. By taking part in the strike action together, this can start to have an effect of undermining entrenched ideas about sexism, that in practice, ordinary people start to see that their real enemy are the bosses, regardless of whether they're men or women, and that they have a common interest in fighting the system together. I'd argue that this tendency towards challenging oppression in revolutionary contexts is true even if the revolution is a political revolution rather than a social one. In other words, even if it still has fairly limited aims of changing the political structures of society, not necessarily trying to rewrite the whole economic and social system. We can come on and discuss this later, but actually one of the key points here about revolution is that even social revolutions, certainly even the Russian Revolution in 1917, didn't start with the aim of creating a new social order. They started with fairly limited aims, and in the case, as I mentioned, in the case of the textile workers in St. Petersburg in 1917. Their aims were to be paid better, largely to be paid better, and to get their bullying bosses off their backs, rather than to overthrow the Tsar. Can I have the next slide, please? So, if we think about this in terms of a case study on women workers in the Egyptian Revolution, I think we can see some of these things playing out. So, I want to talk a little bit here about how working class women played a key role in the strike wave, which paved the way for the revolution in 2011. Women garment workers, for example, started the major strike by 24,000 workers at Masra Spinning in Mahal al-Kubra in 2006, which marked the beginning of the mass strikes which shook the regime for 3 or 4 years before 2011. This was a very significant strike. As I mentioned already, 24,000 workers took part in it, and it was started off by the garment workers in the factory, who were traditionally women. It's a very largely female workforce in the garment producing parts of the factory. The men were largely concentrated in the more skilled and better paid jobs in the spinning and weaving sheds. Famously, the women started the strike and stormed out into the main courtyard, shouting, "Here are the women, where are the men?" and basically shamed their male colleagues for leaving behind their spinning and weaving machines and coming and joining them. And this was despite the fact that actually women workers in Masra Spinning were a minority of the workers. And as I said already, they were actually concentrated in the least well paid and considered jobs that were considered least skilled in the whole textile complex. And this strike in 2006 was the touch paper, if you like. It was the spark that started a very big wave of strikes after that. Women were also strike organizers and leaders in other garment factories, in the tobacco industry, in the civil service. So, for example, there were leading women organizers in the property tax collectors strike, which took place the following year, which led to the formation of the first independent trade union in Egypt for 50 years. Also, women were prominent in organizing in health and in education. And they took on new public roles as activists. They challenged existing social conventions, such as, for example, the garment workers in Al-Mansura España factory, who took part in factory occupations and slept over in the factory with their male colleagues, demanding better pay. This was challenging a huge taboo for women to spend a night it's not just taking part in collective action, but sleeping they slept on the shop floor in the factory alongside their male colleagues who they weren't related to and they weren't married to. And actually they faced a lot of specifically sexist oppression from the state, which tried to say they were prostitutes and repressed them on that basis. But actually the unity between male and female workers involved in the strike was an important source of strength. when we come on to the Egyptian revolution itself, the outbreak of revolution in 2011, again, women were extremely prominent in the protests and on the streets, taking part in mass marches, in a huge further wave of strikes, and also starting to take up issues such as sexual harassment, and challenging and fighting back over questions of sexism in society more generally. Can I have the next slide, please? If we then take as another case study the question of women and the Sudanese revolution, again we can see the revolutionary process that started in late 2018, so about a year and a half ago. They've been organising street protests, leading chants, mobilising support for the mass sit-ins, which have mobilised tens of thousands of people, sitting in the streets to demand particular reforms and changes, and organising, and as well as strike organisers. The revolution in Sudan, particularly at the early phases, also saw things like online women's networks on social media played a big role in spreading the revolution's demands. For example, there were major Facebook groups run by women, which had previously been they weren't political forums. They'd mainly discussed fashion or issues to do with relationships. They started at a key moment early in the revolutionary process. They started sharing the photos and names of police officers who were beating up women protesters in the streets and beating up protesters in the streets, and saying and calling them out and shaming them and identifying them, so that they would then be they couldn't hide themselves from their communities. This was apparent, according to many Sudanese women activists I've talked to. This was actually a very effective way of broadening the base of support for the revolution, and caused a lot of difficulty for the police going into neighbourhoods and trying to arrest people, because women would come out and shame them. One of the things that I'm going to come on to in a minute, though, is the way that women's presence in the streets was particularly important, because there was a specific way that the existing ruling regime, the regime of Omar al-Bashir, had created laws to punish women for so-called immorality in the name of Islam. Can I have the next slide, please? So al-Bashir's dictatorship hit women in two ways. Firstly, through the various neoliberal policies, it increased their double burden through degradation of socialized services such as health and education, which we spoke about previously, as being really important to relieving women of the burden of work inside the home. And in addition, of course, it diverted huge amounts of state resources to war and military spending, but it also used a rhetoric of so-called Islamic values to punish them for protest. Women, for example, could be flogged for failing to wear apparently modest dress in public. One of the things that I would say about this is that actually the way in which the regime targeted women and used a rhetoric of that this was about Islam was a classic tactic of divide and rule, that by beating women up for daring to go out in public, not necessarily not even to protest, but to be in public at all, was designed to have an effect of making it harder for anyone to protest. It was also designed to enforce division between men and women, so that men who were oppressed or exploited by the regime would feel that at least they were superior to women. And that by linking this to a rhetoric of so-called Islamic values, that this was a way in which the regime could mobilize support for itself. However, I don't believe that this is anything to do with Islam per se, or even to do with the fact that the regime was specifically allied with an Islamist political party for many years, although they sometimes fell out with each other. Actually, if you look at, for example, the military regime of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who is in power in Egypt at the moment, that his regime has mobilized some of very, very similar reactionary rhetoric about women's role in society, despite the fact that this is, to some extent, a secular regime, or at least one in which has been involved in repressing an Islamist opposition. It's not one which has been has promoted itself as an Islamist regime in the same way as al-Bashir's regime. What El-Sisi's regime has done is it promoted the idea of the army as a kind of male protector of women's virtue. He personally was in charge of military intelligence when military intelligence officers assaulted women protesters who had been arrested in 2011 by carrying out so-called virginity tests on them. And it has continued to intensify women's double burden by further attacks on healthcare, education, and state subsidies for basic goods in order to conform to the demands of neoliberal restructuring of the economy. Can I have the next slide, please? So the final point that I really want to come back to here is the question of social revolution and women's liberation. I would argue that women's liberation is central to the question of revolution, and that in order to get rid of oppression and exploitation for good, we need not just political revolutions and social reforms, but rather a social revolution against capitalism. The continuation of women's oppression in so-called advanced capitalist countries and the perpetual attempts to reverse the gains made towards equality confirm this point. If you, for example, take the case of what's happened to women around the world as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. In Britain, one of the really obvious things about the coronavirus pandemic is the way in which that women have been disproportionately affected by the failures of the system. For example, that it's women who have largely borne the brunt of having to educate children at home because schools have been closed. There will be a much larger number of women will lose their jobs as a result of the huge wave of unemployment that has started to hit society as the capitalist ruling class attempts to make ordinary people pay for the costs of dealing with the crisis. And if this can happen in the most advanced capitalist countries, then it certainly happens to an even greater degree in countries where capitalism is weaker and or less developed. That's why I'd argue that the revolution against capitalism must be a revolution against women's oppression, but one in which women and men fight together to overcome a system which exploits and oppresses both of them. I think the revolutions that we've seen in the Middle East point to the possibilities, the transformation that can take place in society as a result of revolutionary change, and particularly through the inspiring role of women in leading and organising them. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne, for your as well as the contemporary revolutions such as Arab Spring and Sudan. So, teman-teman, saya buka sesi diskusi sekarang untuk pertanyaan atau tanggapan. So, I'm opening the discussion session for question and answers. If you all have questions regarding the presentations or anything about women's oppression. So now we already have a question from Andy. I'm going to read it to you. That's quite how many questions is this? Wait, let me see. Okay, first question. In Indonesia, women and women's movement have a key role in bringing down Suharto authoritarian regime and opening the way for Reformation era in 1998. At the same time, the history of the important role of the women's, sorry, I lost that wait, of the women's movement in the social movement is hidden. When Indonesia entered the reform era, there was a new hope that there will be an improvement in the condition of women. There are important achievements, for example, like 30% quota for women in the parliament, in the election law, and the bill of domestic violence. But after 22 years of reform era in Indonesia, it is seen that the women's movement is experiencing obstacles. So Andi said that the first obstacle is the issue of oppression against women is considered not as an important issue, just private matter, not a national issue. And then second, corruption and dynastic politics occur in parliament. Third, the rise of women conservative movement who actually take up democratic space to reject or taking back the forms of struggle of the women's movement and the women's workers movement. So she asked, is this also happening in those countries? Is the key role of women in the revolution having long-term effects for elimination of the oppression of women or women liberations? What are their strategies? Okay, yeah, that's the question. That's a question from our comrade Andi. So would you like to answer it first, or you want to?
Yeah, I can. So I can say a little bit about what has happened since the revolutions. I think firstly, one of the things that is quite important in terms of comparing the outcome of the struggle for reform in Indonesia and the outcomes of the 2011 revolutions is that actually in some ways the 1998 struggle in Indonesia resulted in more significant and longer lasting changes at the level of the state in Indonesia than have been achieved by the wave of revolutions in 2011 in the Middle East. So if you look at, for example, with the exception of Tunisia, every other revolution or mass uprising from 2000, the wave that struck the region in 2011 in the Middle East, actually has been rolled back. So rather than achieving reforms, or if there were reforms were achieved, they were very temporary. Actually, there has been an absolutely vicious counter-revolution, which threw society backwards in terms of the level of political repression. And as I mentioned before, Sisi's dictatorship has also had significantly very negative effects for women in somewhere like Egypt. Or if you look at the situation for women in Syria, where the revolution was crushed by a counter-revolution that took the form of a sectarian civil war. It took the form of the regime basically declaring war on its own people and destroying large parts of Syrian society. So that was obviously a huge step backwards. I think it will be interesting to see what happens in Sudan as a result of the revolutionary movement. So for example, the Sudanese revolutionary movement has started to raise lots of issues about women's representation in politics, women's representation in key political institutions has definitely expanded as a result of the revolution. So it could be that there is a longer term gain in terms of reforms that open up greater space for women's participation and some give that some stability. One of the problems, though, which we can come on to and discuss later, is the question of the state. Is that the reason why the revolutions from 2011 to 2013 ended up being rolled backwards was because the people who were still in charge of the repressive apparatus of the state stayed the same throughout the process. And rather than allow a kind of reformist solution to emerge, they were prepared to carry out horrific violence in order to reimpose the power of the old regime in an even more vicious form. I don't know enough about Indonesian history, and I think it would be an interesting comparison to make to know why that didn't take quite the same. You didn't have quite the same thing happen in Indonesia after 1998, and maybe comrades here would like to say something about that. What they, if there's something about the way in which capitalism works in Indonesia that meant there was a greater space for some reforms to persist. That wasn't the case in most of the countries in the Middle East after 2011. I just want one more quick point, which, because I don't want to take too long answering questions, but one more quick point here is one of the things that's very interesting, though, is that the questions related to, for example, sexual harassment actually haven't gone away or haven't been repressed the regime hasn't been able to just get rid of these questions. There is at the moment in Egypt a huge kind of political ferment and crisis around question of sexual harassment and abuse of women. Even under a very repressive dictatorship, actually there is, there's organising and debate and discussion going on about this in a way that I think would have been hard to imagine taking place before the revolution of 2011. There's the regime has not been able to simply respond in a repressive way to these questions emerging. The current sort of debate and crisis in Egypt around sexual harassment has been sparked by young women who are using social media to talk about their experiences, their everyday experiences of sexual harassment, in some cases to name their harassers and abusers and rapists publicly and shame them. The regime responded at first in a completely repressive way and arrested women who did this. And arrested them under all sorts of different guises, so often under kind of notions about immorality and saying they were being, they were undermining family values. But actually, they've also been forced to make some concessions and to talk about greater legal protection for women, which I think is not because the regime has somehow had some sort of enlightenment about this. It's actually to do with, I think, the pressures, the genuine pressures around this question and the legacy of organising around sexual harassment during the revolution in 2011.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you want me to come on to the next question from Amalia?
Yes, from Amalia. Okay. Oh, you can. Yeah,
yes.
It's for. Yeah, you can read it as well here.
So no, I can see the chat as well. So how did women finally realise that they needed a revolution? Well, as I said, I think it's kind of one of the things about revolution is that people don't generally necessarily realise they need a revolution until they start doing it. If you ask the women organisers of the strikes in Egypt before 2011 whether they needed a revolution, I expect almost none of them would have said yes, because they had no direct experience of revolution, and they would have probably thought that actually what they just wanted their rights. They wanted better pay, better conditions. They wanted fairly concrete and straightforward things. The point was, when they started trying to get those things, really basic things like getting paid on time, or not being sexually harassed in the workplace, or being able to afford to buy food for their kids, that the process of fighting for those things started to change their views, and by participating in all of these different kinds of resistance, they actually were able to their consciousness shifted. I mean, I was in Tahrir Square during the first stage of the revolution, and I remember really clearly, one of my most vivid memories is walking past a crowd in part of the square, and somebody was standing up on a soapbox or a ladder with a megaphone, was talking to the crowd, and the speaker was saying, was talking about these protests. We've got to continue these protests. And the crowd started shouting back, they're not protests, it's a revolution, it's a revolution. And most of the, this was hundreds of people. They weren't revolutionary socialists. Most of them were. I would be very surprised if any of them were members of opposition parties, or at any rate, if any of them had ever necessarily before that moment really considered what a revolution might mean and why they might need one. But in the process of fighting for very basic things, basic dignity, not being hit by the police, not being, rights to, put food on the table for your kids, they'd started to change their views about how what their role could be in changing the world, and that's really the genesis of the revolutionary sparks of revolutionary consciousness. In terms of women's consciousness, that specifically a revolution was needed to change their lives and that they could make it. Again, it's a kind of process that takes place, but gets faster and faster the more that women are involved in organising things. I'll find and share a link in the chat to some interviews that we did with women activists during the revolution in Egypt in 2011, and you can kind of see when you read those interviews that women's participation in the process of revolution in their workplaces started to make them think about how society should work in different ways, and they began to link up in the course of that year in 2011. Some of their hopes for change were linked with the revolution. So and I think if you talk to Sudanese activists, you get a similar picture that actually it's not necessarily that women come to have a revolutionary consciousness before the revolution starts to happen, but it can develop very quickly once it is.
Interesting, yeah. Because there's an assumption that if you want to start a revolution, you have to have the revolutionary awareness before. And while there are also people who say, or activists and academics who say it's a revolutionary by practice. So if you want to have a class consciousness, you just have to confront it with the contradictions right in your face. So there's this practice by learning by doing.
Yes. So I mean, just on that point, I mean, I'm not saying that there is no role for having people with revolutionary consciousness before revolutions happen. Quite the opposite. I would argue it is extremely important to have some people who have revolutionary consciousness and revolutionary organisation before a revolution. But revolutions don't start because that minority of people become by magic or by education or by the flash of light in their brains that they become revolutionary. Revolutions are always started when the majority of people are not revolutionary. They don't think that they need a revolution. They think they need bread. They think they need social justice. They think they need, concrete, basic things, dignity, whatever it is. And they start fighting for them. And then you get this transformation. But to link to your point about, so it doesn't matter, it does actually matter a huge amount as to if there are some people who have thought about revolutions first, and then they can win people over to why you need to develop and deepen the revolutionary process, and particularly why you have to confront the state, so that as you get into a revolution, you don't end up with just running out of steam, or stopping partway through, stopping at the stage of reforms, and actually continue and deepen the revolutionary process. If you don't win people to revolutionary ideas before a revolution, then when that happens, you won't have enough weight and organisation to be able to influence how the revolution develops. You see what I mean?
Amalia also mentioned about in Indonesia, I think women workers actually realize that they have this double burden, but they are not automatically feel they need revolution. So I think you already explained that about the revolutionary minds. So
Yes.
okay, we can go to the next question from Sekar Surowijoyo. Indonesia once had a female president. Even today, they are in government, from village heads to governors, but sometimes they are only part of oligarchy. Does that also happen in the Middle East? How to deal with problems where women are only a tool to maintain capital or oligarchy?
Well, I mean, as you can see, I don't know if you could read my T-shirt. I have still hate Thatcher. Having a female prime minister or president doesn't equate into automatic gains for women. Margaret Thatcher is a good example. I'll come on to the Middle East in a minute. Margaret Thatcher presided over a huge wave of attacks on women's living standards, on women's rights, neoliberalism, which is the kind of set of economic policies that she was associated with, not on her own, but she was one of the key people who argued for neoliberal ideas and implemented them, had a disproportionate effect on women. They particularly attacked so all of those bits of the state's socialized functions that deliver things like healthcare and education, and also actually were one of the major areas of women's employment, came under sustained attack under neoliberalism. Thatcher drove that through, and despite the fact that she personally had ascended to the top of the oligarchy, or the top of the highest position in the state. Oh, and of course the actual titular head of state is the Queen. I mean, like, as if that the British Queen does not either do anything to undo women's oppression. And if you look at the heads of major capitalist institutions, Christine Lagarde from the IMF is a woman. Angela Merkel is a woman. There have been women presidents and leaders. It's not true that these women don't also face sexism, and they may have to deal with sexism from within their own class. That is true, but their loyalty is first and foremost to reproducing reproducing the conditions for the ruling class staying in power, and so therefore they are the enemies of ordinary women, and an obstacle to the achievement of women's liberation. And I think it would be the same in the Middle East. As it happens, I mean, in Middle Eastern countries, there is probably lower levels of women's participation in some aspects of political life. Although, I mean, as I mentioned before, it's at moments when there are revolutionary upsurges, mass mobilizations, that starts to challenge those kinds of things. So women. So as I mentioned in the case of Sudan, one of the things that happened in the course of the revolution was that women played an incredibly important, visible role leading the revolution. When it came to the negotiations that were going to take place with the old regime to try and come up with a sort of negotiated exit from the crisis, there were only, I think there was only one woman was involved in the negotiations, and quite a lot of women activists said, hang on, that's not right. Why should we be on the front line in the barricades and on the streets, and then you think that you can just relegate us to a backroom position and that we'll just be cheerleaders for the men? They actually organised to push for quotas for women's involvement in the different bodies that have been set up, and there are a number of women who've taken on prominent governmental roles as a result of the revolution. And that's an example of where those things have gone forward. In terms of Sekhar's point, yes, I think that's I think we have to say, I think it's important to argue that simply having more women in positions of power, if capitalism remains the economic system, will not deal with the problem of women's oppression, because they will put the interests of their class, of the ruling class, in front of the interests of their gender, of liberating women.
Yeah. Well, I actually have a question for you. You mentioned interesting part about sexual harassment and about how the regime, the government, sort of like making the stereotypes of women as in terms of their moral, that they're immoral if they do the demonstrations, and most of there are cases where the struggles of women in terms of against oppression is more emphasized on their autonomy of their body, that they are free to express their identities and their bodies, but when it deals with the crisis of capitalism, it's a bit tricky to shift the discussion from sort of like sexual politics and identity politics into like the class analysis that is central to the questions of revolution, particularly in religious countries or the so-called Muslim majority countries, where religion is often being used by the regime, especially against women, in terms of their morality. So, if you reflect this from the cases in the Middle East, in the Arab Spring, and in Sudan, what kind of how do these women revolutionaries deal with that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I mean, I think the first and basic thing to say here is that when we're talking about women's bodies under capitalism, that whatever the kind of complexion of the capitalist regime that it's under, whether it's one where the ruling class is largely Muslim or largely Christian or doesn't really care what religion it is, that women's bodies continue to be treated as objects and subject to all sorts of restrictions and labeling and all kinds of ideologies that mean that women become alienated from their own bodies for all sorts of reasons. Some of them are to do with the forms of alienation that are embedded in the way that work happens under capitalism. So the worship of commodities, which Marx called kind of commodity fetishism, actually has very big implications for women, because it means that in order to be sold things, women's bodies get objectified and turned into kind of commodified in the process. I'll give you an example. So there is, selling women beauty products. If you think about it, like wear makeup or certain types of fashion, these become something that is about making profit for capitalists. So they want women to firstly consume lots of them, but also that instead of how you using makeup or wearing clothes as a means of self-expression, actually this is something that is a huge industry. And so from a very young age, females in our society, girls and then young women, are kind of fed these ideas about how they should look. And capitalism can cope perfectly well with the idea that in some contexts, the push is towards women must cover themselves and they have to wear particular sorts of clothing, and that's perfectly compatible with capitalism, covering up women's bodies. But in other contexts, then women exposing their bodies and commodifying sexual relationships. So if you look at, you have this, this situation where in some parts of the capitalist world, women are told that they have to dress modestly, and in other parts of the capitalist world, they're told, it's celebrated the idea that they should take their clothes off. And in neither case is it about women's own self-expression, that their own choice about what they want to wear. I mean, like, for example, there's a major supermarket chain in Britain is Tesco's. A few years ago, I was shopping in Tesco's and I looked at the baby clothes, and they had a baby grow, as in for a child of 6 months old, which said on here, it said, "Does my bum look big in this?" Which is actually, yes, it's kind of funny, but it's also really twisted. This is a 6-month-old baby girl, and she can't even read it, but you're turning her into an object where she's supposed to worry about whether her bum looks big in this. Actually, it's utterly kind of twisted, and this is used to sell clothes. You look at, little girls in British culture, in British society, little girls' outfits are sparkly and pink and sequins. They have Disney princesses on them, and any form of sort of self-expression in dressing is ripped out of kids. I mean, and if boys want to wear pink stuff, and if boys want to dress in whatever ways they want, they're also shunted into very specific and gendered ways of dressing and being. So this is a fundamental problem in capitalist society, which affects everybody and distorts relations between men and women. So that is one part of the problem. We live in a society which is poisoned by this thing. So then the question arises: is, well, how do we fight? How do we fight back? Is it the case that in the course of that we can just focus on bodies and identities, and that self-expression in itself will open the door to liberation? And I don't think, unfortunately, that's the case. I think that dressing the way that you want, and cutting the hair the way you want, and your rights to bodily autonomy in terms of the sexual relationships that you want to have, all sorts of things about control over your own body, that unless you also engaged in a struggle to overcome the roots of the problem, as in you're fighting back against the system as a whole, that actually capitalism can cope with those forms of self-expression and tends to just isolate people. So if the rebellion that you're engaged in is only at a level of expressing yourself, as individuals, or even kind of collectively, unless it challenges the fundamental processes of exploitation, in the end, it will just either leave those questions of embodiment isolated, and or just accessible to people who've got enough money to do it, basically. That it becomes the kinds of self-expression then get tied up with, can you afford to avoid the pressures that are on everyone else? That's not to downplay the importance of fighting for rights in these areas, and that socialists should always be in solidarity with people who face oppression because of their choices around these things, whether that's around their sexual preferences or around how they dress, or the fact that they like heavy metal and they live in a state that decides that they are engaged in Satanism. This has happened quite a bit in the Middle East. All of those things, we need to fight back against them and understand them. But on their own, I don't think that they can challenge things. And the other point that follows on from this is that people who have reactionary views, confused views, or outright reactionary views about some of these issues, who are ordinary people, who are part of the working class, or are other classes in society who are facing oppression and exploitation, that they can change their ideas in the process of fighting with them in a way that makes them our potential allies, in a way that ruling class women, for example, are not. So I'll give you an example from Britain, okay? In the miners' strike, in 1984 to 1985, there was a massive strike by coal miners, and their union was very well organised. It was one of the most well organised and most militant unions in the British working class at the time, and they had a huge struggle with the Thatcher government between 1984 and 1985, which was all about smashing. The government wanted to smash the miners' union organisation. The miners at the time, this is coal mining, so they're largely men. Women in mining communities didn't generally work in the mines. They worked in other jobs, or they were housewives. And the male miners had lots of sexist ideas. They had a newspaper for their union which had naked women in it. There is a reactionary newspaper called The Sun in Britain, which for many years had a thing called Page 3, and on Page 3 there was a woman with her breasts out, and this was included as a way to sell newspapers, so that men could open it up and they could look at a picture of a woman with no top on and they could go "Fwah." And this made a lot of money for the newspaper, and it was very common. It was a common practice in other newspapers as well. The miners' newspaper, the union newspaper, had one of those Page 3 pictures. It used to have pictures of naked women in it. They stopped having it because women activists changed the minds of male activists who understood, as a result of fighting together on the picket lines, organising in solidarity, they abandoned some of their sexist ideas, and they voted to get rid of the Page 3 in the miners' newspaper. And I don't know if people have also seen the film Pride, which is about how lesbian and gay activists supported the miners during their struggle against the government, and as a result also changed some of their homophobic ideas and encouraged them to think differently about that kind of oppression. So the point is here that the questions around oppression can be challenged in struggle when you're involved in struggle against the things that are the root causes of oppression and exploitation.
Okay, well, we have another question from Putri. She chat me. She said, I believe that we need to have revolutionary awareness, as you mentioned before. What are the conditions in Egypt? What are their strategies, the strategies of progressive women there to raise more revolutionary awareness to a more broad section of society? You mentioned earlier about the garment workers that they've been doing the uprising since 2006, 2016?
Yeah, 2000, yes.
Yeah, before the revolution. How do you
so I mean, in Egypt today, it's important to emphasize that actually the space for political organizing in Egypt, and certainly anything that is critical of the regime, is very narrow. The level of repression is incredibly high. There are tens of thousands of political prisoners, including many women activists, including many many women activists are involved are in jail. I mean, people like Mahinur al-Masri, who's a lawyer, and she's a human rights and labour lawyer activist. She's been in jail multiple times, and she's currently in jail, and so on. So it is very hard for women and for men and women activists to organise in Egypt at the moment. In terms of the strategies that are the women activists are pursuing, I mean, I think there are a number of areas where you can see organising is taking place. One of which is that there is ongoing organising around the questions of sexual harassment, and putting demands out, which actually, around the recent wave of kind of debates about sexual harassment in society, you can see it's very interesting that this experience of sexual harassment and the repressive response of the regime is also radicalizing new layers of women towards kinds of activism who don't necessarily have links to the existing opposition parties, or the kind of traditional left parties or Islamist parties. I mean, some of it is, I think, young women are drawing conclusions from their own experience. And in fact, the role of things like social media is quite important here, because some of that has given some of this generation of young women access to kind of public audiences that they wouldn't have before. Now, that doesn't automatically translate into revolutionary consciousness by any means, but I think it's quite an important development. It's one of the reasons why it's hard for the regime to just completely keep everything under control anymore. It's also really important to emphasize that in Egypt, as in other countries, that struggles over social questions, in particular sort of social justice issues, like access to, not necessarily over jobs directly, but over things like access to food. So, when there's been cuts to subsidies, the state used to subsidize lots of basic goods. The state has cut back on those subsidies, and that's meant prices have risen. Now, there are often forms of protest around rising prices are often things that women have participated in. Or another area where women activists will be involved, and which is among working class and poor communities, or rural or urban and rural communities, is also around struggles over land and housing. So there are working class communities that are, where, for example, property developers are coming in, taking over, trying to dismantle people's homes, and to clear slums, they like to call it, to build luxury. So, for example, maybe to build luxury flats, or to build a factory, or to do something for a property investment. The military is often very involved in these. There's a whole number of struggles in central Cairo, in the islands that are in the middle of the Nile, where ordinary people have been involved in resisting property developers backed up by the military. It's often that land is in fact owned by the military, who are trying to clear away their houses. And when you look at I don't know the names of the women who are organizing this, but you look at the pictures of the protests, and it's clear that these are whole communities involved, and women are very visible in leading the protests. You can see that it's not just men that are resisting; it's also women. And that's an area where, and that's actually something that also took place in the run-up to 2011. There were lots of social struggles by working class and poor communities over access to drinking water, to against property developers, in order to against rising prices of food and things like that women have played an enormously important role in. And then a third area where women have played a particularly important role is actually around prisoner solidarity. So political prisoners, although there are quite a lot of women political prisoners, there's still the majority of political prisoners are men. And so women activists have often their women relatives, have played a very important role in highlighting their cases, in continuing to mobilize for solidarity. And if you think about the role that there's actually, this is historically quite an important feature of struggles against authoritarian regimes and dictatorships. If you think about, for example, in Argentina, in the struggle against the dictatorship there, women played an important role in mobilizing, demanding justice for their children or their husbands or brothers who disappeared, who had been kidnapped and killed by the regime. And in a way, there's a similar role for women activists has been playing in the Egyptian context.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. So we have another question from Hugo in Facebook.
Yes.
Yes. He quoted from Alexandra Kollontai, "The social basis of women question," that's what she wrote, "for the condition of women's struggle in the early 20th century. Does the point in Alexandra's writing still relevant in the condition of women in 21st century, or maybe there are new struggles for women in this 21st century capitalism?" Thank you.
That's a good question. I mean, actually, yes, I think a lot of what Alexandra Kollontai was writing about is still very relevant. Alexandra Kollontai was actually one of the Bolshevik leaders who was responsible personally for kind of being one of the leading figures in the drive to improve women's rights in the immediate aftermath of the revolution. And there are lots of things that she instituted, she was fighting for, which we don't have today. Communal restaurants, laundries. They, had a huge drive to try and eradicate illiteracy, expanding opportunities in terms of education. In many ways, there are things that that Kollontai and her comrades achieved in a much, in much more difficult circumstances that 21st century British capitalism hasn't managed to achieve for women. So I think it's very relevant. It's a lot of what she talked about is still very relevant. But it is also important, though, of course, to recognise that the capitalism that the form of capitalism that she was in 20th century Russia, early 20th century Russia, the conditions are not the same now. The general general reasons for women's oppression are still there, but there are things that have developed. There are lots of struggles that take place, that are around issues that that weren't as apparent in an earlier phase of capitalist development. One of which is the question of the environment and climate change. Where in the early 20th century, although capitalism was clearly having a hugely destructive impact on the environment, and actually some of the ways in which capitalism was organized at that stage, changes were being made in capitalist organization of production that were setting us on a collision course with the natural world we live in, and starting on the path towards huge damage through climate change and mass extinctions. But it wasn't a looming danger for everyone everywhere in the same way that it is at the moment. So, and there's a lot of interesting questions to talk through about, again, who, in terms of the impact on women of increasing climate change, and again, how women are likely to be affected because of the oppression that they face in more intense ways than men. So yes, there are plenty of things that can be added and expanded on, but I think it's well worth looking at Alexandra Kollontai's writings and the writings of women socialists, or like Clara Zetkin, Rosa Luxemburg, their experiences and their things that they fought for are still very relevant to discuss today.
It seems like the forum are enthusiastic, and we have another questions actually. um, oh, you need probably if you need to have some drink, it's yeah, it's fine. Okay, so Amalia asked another question. She said, in her view on Egypt, women conservative hated feminism because they were misunderstood that advertisements showing women's bodies were seen as a necessity for feminism. So there's this stereotype of conservative women against the so-called feminism. So while in fact it is a problem of capitalism, like you already elaborated earlier. And how do women from progressive circles in Egypt actually establish relationship with the conservative women? How is their relationship? Are they confronting each other? That's the question from Amalia.
I don't really know enough about that specifically in terms of what's going on in Egypt today. I mean, historically in Egypt, there's been, and this is true in across a lot of the Middle East, that there was there's a kind of historic division between women who came through an Islamist tradition, some of whom are more conservative and some less conservative, who were involved in political activism around which was framed in terms of their Muslim beliefs, versus women who came from whose political activism was framed around either liberal or leftist secular beliefs. And in the case of Egypt, one of the things that the regime before 2011 did quite successfully was to co-opt a layer of women from a kind of secular tradition, some of which came from a kind of Stalinist leftist tradition, some from a more liberal tradition, and to make them actually quite complicit in the regime's abuses of the Islamist opposition at the time. And this was quite important, and I think very problematic, because it meant that, for example, the regime often tried to cover up its human rights abuses in this kind of way, and that there was a layer of people on the left who thought that the regime was a lesser evil than the Islamist opposition groups, when actually among the Islamist opposition there was a really wide range of views about women's role in society, about women's liberation, and that there were, ranging from people who had women who had very radical views and liberal views politically, to women who also had had very kind of reactionary views about women's role in society. And that on the kind of secular side, if you like, again, there were women who had very reactionary views and women who had more liberal views. That one of the tragedies was that there was a lack of unity often around basic questions between women and men from Islamist backgrounds and secular backgrounds, where they were both opposed to the regime. And the regime used this kind of divide and rule tactic quite effectively. One of the interesting things that happened, and where actually there was a huge amount of important political developments in terms of creating the conditions for a much broader opposition to emerge to the regime, was in the last sort of 10 years or so before 2011. There were all sorts of joint initiatives where women from women and men who were involved with Islamist opposition groups, some around the Muslim Brotherhood, some around other groups, actually worked together with secular leftist and liberal activists around the things that they agreed about. So, for example, in defense of political prisoners, or in opposition to the war on Iraq, or in solidarity with Palestine, or around other kinds of causes, around the fight for democracy and democratic rights. And that helped to break down some of the divisions that the regime had played on very effectively. Another example from a different country, Algeria, is that having talked to Algerian activists recently, I think there has been there's been a shift inside Algerian politics, where the regime that's currently being confronted by a mass movement and so on from below, in which women are playing a massive role, has also been able in the past to set Islamist activists and non-Islamist activists against each other, and to divide them, partly because of the experience of what happened in the 1990s when the military came in and overthrew an elected Islamist government, and then there was and essentially launched a process of civil war, in which armed Islamist groups fought the government but also killed loads of people, and that really badly scarred society, meaning that Islamist groups and the left didn't necessarily talk to each other about the things they agreed on. So I think in Algeria there's been some important steps towards like platforms of discussion. Where one of the issues is around questions of women's rights, women's liberation. In Algeria, the family code that's currently in place massively restricts women's rights, and that's one of the things that feminist groups in Algeria have been raising and campaigning around. I think that it's important to have spaces where women from different political backgrounds can actually find a common ground to fight together for serious reforms, and then can discuss and debate among themselves about how to take forward the struggle for liberation.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Well, I have a final question actually from you. I know that there is the time constraint, and I think we could collect questions and comments from social media, and if you're okay, we could send it to you, and you can give response later on, and we can post it.
Yes.
On social media. And so I would actually ask you my final question before your closing remarks. And as oppression is used by the ruling class to kind of like divide the ordinary people. And you said keep them suspicious against each other. And the challenge is to address this kind of like division in the current times, where it is often like socialists are often accused as class determinists because they're considered not taken considerations of other elements in societies. And you mentioned about capitalism reinforces women's oppression and facilitates recreates of family. I remember Marx mentioned about social reproduction in capital in part of the transformation from money to capital, but without further detail on women's role. While social reproduction is crucial for capitalism because that's where women reproduce and maintain their family members as laborers for the capitalists. And so, in terms of women in revolution, I think social reproduction is also central in the question of their role in the revolution. But I quoted your article actually in ISJ. You wrote, if revolution is really to become the choice of the people, an organization of revolutionaries is necessary to steer the struggle to its conclusion. So dealing with all these challenges, how do we gain confidence in this? Because lots of social movements now are scattered into like micro movements, often leaderless and without programmatic kind of agenda after the uprising or after the revolutions. And how do we kind of like connect all these issues of women and revolution and capitalism? I know it's a really broad question, but just
Yes.
share
No, it's a good question. It's a good question to finish on. And I think there's basically two. I think there's basically two parts to the answer. First is that you need to have, if you're going to be organized as a revolutionary, you need to be intervening in people's everyday, in the struggles that people are engaged in their everyday lives. So it is important to have a connection to not just theoretical discussions, but actually to be on the side of the oppressed and the exploited wherever they're fighting back. So that can involve quite a wide variety of things. So, for example, if there's a strike by workers, then that you go and organise solidarity for the strike as a revolutionary, even if it doesn't matter that they're not revolutionaries. That's not why you're doing it. You're doing it because they are engaged actively in organising to change the world, and that will make it more likely they'll listen to you if you talk to them about revolution, because they're engaged in struggle, and actually they are fighting back against the people who are all our enemy. If they win their battle for, even if it's for something that seems quite trivial, it could be a battle that's about having a 15-minute tea break in the course of their afternoon. If they win it, then actually that will encourage other people to do the same. So it's a concrete victory. A victory for our side always does, it makes a difference. And if you as a revolutionary are not involved in those day-to-day everyday things where people are fighting back, first you'll just end up being an academic, and who wants to be an academic? I know I'm an academic, but that's my day job. It's nothing to do with my revolutionary politics. It's academics just perpetuate the system we all live in. So you need to be part of the struggles of everyday people's struggles, because actually that's where Marxism comes from. It didn't come out of Marx's head. It came out of Marx and Engels observing and being part of, in an active way, organizing solidarity for workers, for people who were fighting for democratic rights, for all of those things. That's where it didn't come out of some genius thing in his head. It came out of the interactions between people's real struggles. And this is the second part of the equation, though. You do need to develop theoretical understandings of the world. You have to have a relationship between the theory and the practice. That if you just do the activism in a sort of solidarity way, as you mentioned, you can have people will fight back. They will struggle against the conditions of their oppression and exploitation. That isn't in any doubt. What is not guaranteed is that those struggles will connect up in such a way as they can challenge the roots of the problem. And this is true in terms of women's oppression, and it's true of everything else. That in the that unless there is you need an organization of revolutionaries, which I would argue it actually needs to be a minority of revolutionaries who agree about quite a lot of things. That they agree about, for example, the role of the state, and they agree about a whole set of things, not just the basic minimum that will unite people in a sort of struggle that's going on at the time. So that necessarily means having a minority, but it's got to be one that is fighting on all fronts, if you like. That it's no good just having, if you want to see revolutionary change, it's no good just having, for example, a trade union which fights in the here and now to win generally kind of small scale reforms, but doesn't really tackle the question of what's the fundamental driver of the system. And also trade unions don't automatically fight over questions of oppression. There are plenty of examples in history where trade unions have perpetuated oppression, including sexism, including racism. There are lots of examples of, the engineers trade union in Britain didn't allow women to be members of it until I think 1945. You know, and I mentioned the case of the miners and the you know, and the sexism that was in part of their trade union history. You know, so you actually need revolutionary organisation to connect up the economic and the political parts of the struggle. And you know, this is where Lenin made a good point about it in his writings in the early 20th century in Russia. He said that revolutionaries should be tribunes of the oppressed and not just trade union secretaries, by which he meant, and in his context, he was talking about things, he was talking about racism and anti-Semitism. Jewish people were horrendously oppressed in the Russian Empire, and the Russian Empire used anti-Semitism to divide the working class. So he actually said it was incredibly important that workers should learn that they have to fight against all forms of oppression, because oppression is used to divide them and make their struggles against the Tsarist state less effective. And that's why no revolutionary could afford to ignore questions of oppression, because otherwise it would be their Achilles heel. It would be a huge weakness that would allow counter-revolution in through the back door to fragment and divide and weaken the revolutionary movement. And that you could see that happening in Egypt in 2013. That, you know, I mentioned about Sisi's regime and its utterly filthy sexism, and its systematic abuse of, you know, assault on women detainees, and its positioning itself as this protector of women's virtue. But it also, in 2013, also started presenting itself as protecting women from the Islamist opposition groups, or from the Muslim Brotherhood when it was in power, and tried to present itself as being more progressive. And some people on the left fell for this, and you know, they didn't see that the way in which the Sisi regime was mobilizing women for counter-revolutionary ends, you know, what it was, it was a fundamental part of the counter-revolution dividing people, dividing its opponents, that it put on these masks of, you know, pretending to be progressive in some way, pretending to be standing up against oppression, and use this, you know, and use this rhetoric in order to try and smash the revolution, in order to make it difficult for people to unite. That's not to say that the Muslim Brotherhood, when it was in power, didn't have quite a lot of reactionary politics and policies. It wasn't a progressive or liberal government, but it was something that the regime that came into power and overthrew it was much more vicious and repressive and reactionary. It had just presented itself to a certain extent as standing up against some forms of oppression. That's the way that questions of oppression work. They're very complex, and that's why you actually have to have, I think, revolutionary organisation and revolutionaries who are conscious of the way in which oppression and exploitation link up with each other, in order to be able to guard against that and to be able to return to the kind of fundamental forms of struggle that help to break down oppression and help to organise in a way that is that can get rid of oppression and exploitation for good.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne, for your really comprehensive answers. We have questions and actually lots of curiosity for this topic. So I think it's a really our pleasure to have you as our speaker for the first time, the first discussions about women and class struggle. So, and also I would like to ask if you probably have a closing remark to deliver to us for participants.
I think I'm not sure if I have anything extra to add, but thank you very much for the chance to talk to you. I'd be happy to try and answer some further questions on, if you've got more questions and you want to send them, I'm happy to write something, or and also actually I have some questions. Can I? I have questions I'd like to send you, because the comrade who was raising the question about reforms after 1998, I would be really interested to read and understand more about that, and I would also be interested to know more about women's participation in work and in society and public life in Indonesia, because for something that I'm working on writing. So maybe you could, if I have some questions, can I send them to you, and then maybe you could recommend me some. You could write some answers or suggest me things to read. I would find that useful.
Great.
So we have a dialogue and an interaction. That would be very beneficial for me. So again, yes. So thank you very much for the chance to speak, and I hope that made sense. And I apologize for not being able to speak Indonesian.
Hello, I'm sorry for my internet connection, just a little bit of technical issue a while ago. Yes, I think it will be a really great opportunity for us to having more discussions with you in terms of Indonesian context. So I think it will be great. So we will definitely email each other, and I will also open the discussion for our friends and comrades as well. So yeah, a while ago.
Just quickly, I just put in the chat a link to an article on social reproduction theory, because you mentioned about social reproduction, and so that's an article that's written by a colleague, Sheila McGregor, which people might find interesting to read, which deals with some of the debates around social reproduction.
Okay. Yes. So thank you, Anne. I will close this session in Indonesian. So hold on a bit. Oke, baik teman-teman. Tadi diskusi yang sangat challenging ya tentang perempuan dan perjuangan kelas. Kita lihat dari presentasi N juga dan dari pertanyaan teman-teman. Terima kasih sekali. Dan jika masih ada pertanyaan atau tanggapan lanjutan yang belum sempat terakomodir di dalam sesi ini, bisa dikirim via akun FIP atau IB, baik di YouTube atau Facebook atau Instagram, dan nanti akan kita sampaikan ke N. Kemudian N juga tadi share beberapa link untuk referensi tambahan yang nanti juga bisa kita publish untuk bisa jadi referensi bersama teman-teman. Baik, saya Rizky Amaliafiat atas nama Forum Islam Progresif dan Islam Bergerak menyampaikan terima kasih yang sebanyak-banyaknya buat teman-teman FIP yang sudah mengelola dan mengordinir Zoom discussion dan YouTube juga. Dan I would also like to again thank you, Anne, for your time and your knowledge sharing with us, as well as your direct experience with the revolutionaries in the Arab world. So it is very highly appreciated. So Zoom discussion. Okay, we're going to close this session. I would also like to we'll see you again in the next time and your live discussions knowledge sharing with us, Forum Islam Progresif, as well as your direct experience with the revolutionaries in the Arab world. So it is very highly appreciated. So Zoom discussion. Okay, we're going to close this session. I would also like to we'll see you again in the next time and your live discussions knowledge sharing with us, Forum Islam Progresif, as well as your direct experience with the revolutionaries in the Arab world. So it is very